Somewhere deep inside the Hoover Dam, in the heart of more than 3 million cubic yards of concrete, there is a chemical reaction that started in the 1930s and is not finished yet. The dam was completed in 1936. Nearly a century ago, the workers who built it are long gone. The world that built it, the Great Depression, a country desperate for work and water and power, is history. And yet the concrete at the core of that dam is, in a very real sense, still not done. It is still reacting, still changing, still, by tiny fractions, getting harder and stronger with each passing year. And here's the part that sounds impossible by some estimates. If the engineers had simply poured the Hoover Dam the obvious way, as one enormous block of concrete, that concrete would still be dangerously hot inside today, almost 100 years later. It would have taken something like a century and a quarter just to cool down. And in cooling, it would have cracked itself to pieces, and the dam would have crumbled long before it ever held back the Colorado River. Tonight, we are going to work out why. Why concrete? The most boring, ordinary building material on Earth. The gray stuff of sidewalks and car parks turns out to behave in a way almost nobody expects. Why a big enough block of it becomes a slow-motion bomb of its own heat. And why the men who built the Hoover Dam had to invent an extraordinary system hidden inside the walls just to stop the concrete from destroying itself while it hardened. To understand it, you have to throw away the single most common belief about concrete. And almost everyone has it wrong. Ask most people how concrete hardens, and they will tell you it dries. You pour it wet, the water evaporates, and it dries out into stone. Simple, wet to dry, like mud in the sun. That is completely wrong. Concrete does not harden by drying. In fact, if you let concrete dry out too fast, it becomes weak and crumbly, the exact opposite of what you want. Concrete hardens by a chemical reaction, a completely different thing from drying. When you mix cement with water, the water does not just soak the powder and then leave. It reacts with it. The cement and the water chemically combine, growing tiny interlocking crystals that reach out and knit together, locking the sand and stone of the concrete into a single solid mass. This process is called hydration. The water is not a temporary ingredient that escapes. It becomes part of the stone. The concrete is not drying, it is crystallizing, chemically, from the inside. And this changes everything, because a chemical reaction has two properties that drying does not. First, it does not simply stop when the surface looks dry. Those crystals keep growing slowly for a very long time, years, decades, in the right conditions, even longer. Concrete keeps gaining strength long after it feels rock hard to the touch. And second, and this is the key to the whole story of the Hoover Dam, this reaction gives off heat. The chemical combining of cement and water is what's called exothermic. It releases energy as warmth. You can feel this yourself. A fresh bag of setting cement gets noticeably warm as it cures. In a small pour, a garden path, a floor, a fence post, that heat is trivial. It escapes into the air almost as fast as it is made, and nobody ever notices. But now scale it up. Really scale it up. The Hoover Dam contains more than 3 million cubic yards of concrete. Enough, engineers like to say, to pave a road across the entire United States. Picture that entire mountain of concrete curing at once. Every part of it all through the mass, undergoing that same heat-releasing reaction at the same time. And now, you hit the problem that nearly made the dam impossible. Heat escapes from a surface, but the inside of a giant block of concrete is nowhere near a surface. It is buried under yards and yards of concrete in every direction, and concrete is a fairly good insulator. So the heat generated deep in the core has almost no way to get out. It builds up, and builds up, and builds up. The engineers ran the numbers, and the answer was frightening. If the Hoover Dam had been poured as a single solid block and simply left to cure on its own, the heat trapped inside would have taken an estimated 125 years to dissipate. 125 years. The core of the dam would still be warm today, deep into our century, slowly releasing the heat of a reaction that finished on the outside before the Second World War. And that slow cooling was not just a curiosity, it was a threat to the dam's very existence. Because here is what happens when a huge mass of concrete heats up unevenly. The outside, near the air, cools and hardens first. The inside stays hot and expanded for far longer, and when the inside finally, slowly cools, it contracts, it shrinks while the outside is already set solid around it. That mismatch tears the concrete apart from within. It creates cracks. Deep, structural, spreading cracks. A dam riddled with those cracks could never safely hold back the immense pressure of a reservoir the size of Lake Mead. It would leak, weaken, and potentially fail catastrophically. So the builders of the Hoover Dam faced a genuinely strange problem. The concrete's own hardening process generated a slow, century-long fever that, left alone, would crack the dam to ruins before it could ever be used. The material they were building with was, in a sense, fighting them. They needed to solve two things at once. They needed to get the heat out of the core far faster than nature would ever allow, and they needed to stop the inside and outside from cooling at wildly different rates. And lest you think this is an old problem, solved once and forgotten, it is not. Every large dam, every massive bridge foundation, every enormous concrete structure built today faces exactly the same enemy. The physics has not changed. Pour enough concrete in one place and it will cook itself from the inside. Modern engineers building the huge dams of our own century still fight the heat of hydration, still pour in stage blocks, still run cooling pipes and chilled water through fresh concrete, still bury sensors to watch the temperature of the core. Some now mix in industrial byproducts like fly ash to slow the reaction down and spread the heat out over more time. But the fundamental battle is identical to the one fought in that Nevada canyon in the 1930s. The Hoover Dam did not solve mass concrete heat once and for all. It was the first great demonstration that the problem even existed at this scale, and that human beings could out-engineer it. Every megastructure since has been fighting the same slow fire. The way they did it at Hoover is one of the great pieces of engineering problem-solving of the 20th century, and most people who drive across that dam have no idea it is there. The first part of the solution was to stop thinking of the dam as one block. Instead, they built it as a giant stack of separate columns, hundreds of individual interlocking blocks, trapezoidal in shape, rising in layers just a few feet at a time. By pouring the concrete in these smaller, manageable blocks rather than one colossal mass, each block had far more surface area for its size and could shed its heat far more easily than the buried heart of a single monolith ever could. The dam you see is not one casting. It is a carefully assembled mosaic of blocks, keyed together, each one allowed to cure in a controlled way before being locked into its neighbors. But breaking it into blocks was not enough on its own. Even those blocks generated too much heat, too deep. So the engineers did something remarkable. They reached into the concrete and cooled it from the inside. As each block was poured, they laid into it a grid of thin steel pipes, inch-wide tubing, woven all through the concrete like a network of veins. And once the concrete was in place, they pumped cold water through those pipes. First, ordinary cool river water. Then, for the parts that needed the most aggressive cooling, refrigerated water, chilled by an ammonia refrigeration plant built right there on site, a plant capable of producing 1,000 pounds of ice a day in the middle of the Nevada desert in the 1930s. The total length of that embedded pipework is almost hard to believe. Running through the body of the Hoover Dam are something on the order of nearly 600 miles of steel cooling pipe. 600 miles buried permanently inside the concrete. Picture what that meant on the ground in the middle of the Great Depression. This was the Nevada desert in the 1930s, where summer temperatures could climb past 120 degrees. There was no city here. The government had to build one, Boulder City, just to house the workforce. Thousands of men, many of them desperate for any work at all in the worst economic collapse in the nation's history, came to labor in that canyon. And in that furnace of a desert, the engineers built a refrigeration plant capable of making 1,000 pounds of ice a day and ran chilled water through miles of pipe to cool concrete. Cooling, in one of the hottest places in America, the very material that was trying to overheat. Men poured concrete around the clock, block after block, layer after layer, while below them the diverted Colorado River waited to be turned loose against the finished wall. It was one of the largest construction projects humanity had ever attempted, and buried invisibly inside all of it was this quiet, relentless war against the heat of the concrete itself. The water flowing through those pipes pulled the heat of hydration out of the core, actively, block by block, doing in a matter of weeks and months what nature would have taken a century and a quarter to do on its own. The engineers could monitor the temperature of each block and control its cooling, making sure no part cooled too fast or too slow, keeping the whole structure from tearing itself apart as it set. And then, once a block had been cooled down and stabilized, they did one final thing. They pumped the pipes full of grout, a thin cement mixture, filling them in completely so that the veins of pipe themselves became part of the solid concrete mass, adding to its strength. The cooling system did its job and then, quietly, became part of the dam forever. Think about the scale of the foresight here. In an era before computers, before modern materials science was mature, engineers understood that their concrete would behave like a slow chemical furnace, calculated exactly how catastrophic that would be, and designed an entire hidden refrigeration system, hundreds of miles of it, purely to manage the temperature of a material as it hardened. They were not just building a wall against a river, they were managing a century-long chemical reaction and racing it and winning. Which brings us back to the strangest fact of all, the one we started with. Even with all of that ingenious cooling, the concrete of the Hoover Dam is still, in the deepest technical sense, curing today. Now, we have to be honest and careful here, because this fact gets wildly exaggerated. The dam is not soft, it is not unstable, it is not dangerously wet inside, and it long ago reached essentially all of the strength it needs to do its job. It got there within the first years, not centuries. Anyone who tells you the Hoover Dam is somehow still gooey in the middle is wrong. But the underlying truth is real and quietly astonishing. Because hydration is a chemical reaction that never fully, perfectly completes in a mass that enormous, the concrete deep inside continues, by tiny fractions, to react and densify and gain strength with each passing year. The crystals are still, ever so slowly, growing. By some estimates, the concrete will keep inching toward its ultimate strength for a very long time. Yet, the dam getting marginally, imperceptibly stronger as the decades pass. Sit with that for a moment. Something human beings finished building in 1936 is, in the year you are watching this, still becoming what it was designed to be. Still completing the reaction that was set in motion by workers who have been dead for generations. It is one of the few things we have ever built that is, in a real chemical sense, still alive in its own slow way, still changing, still hardening, still reacting to the water it was mixed with almost 100 years ago. If a century sounds like a long time for concrete to keep improving, consider that we have examples that have been at it for 2,000 years. The Romans built harbors, domes, and aqueducts out of concrete, and much of it is still standing. Some of it stronger and more intact than concrete we pour today. For a long time, this was a genuine mystery. How did an ancient recipe outlast modern ones? Part of the answer researchers have found is that Roman concrete kept chemically reacting and even healing itself over the centuries. Tiny cracks that let in water triggered fresh reactions that sealed the cracks back up. In other words, the Romans accidentally built concrete that treats its own wounds by continuing to react, slowly, for millennia. It is the same underlying truth the Hoover Dam shows us, stretched across an almost unimaginable span of time. Concrete is not a dead material that is finished the day it sets. It is a chemical process that, in the right conditions, simply keeps going and going. The Hoover Dam has been reacting for under a century. Some Roman concrete has been reacting since before the fall of the empire. And this is the deeper lesson hiding inside all that gray concrete. We think of the material world as static. We build something, it is finished, it just sits there. But the Hoover Dam reveals that even our most solid, permanent-seeming structures are not really finished objects at all. They are processes caught in mid-motion, moving so slowly that to our eyes they look frozen. The dam is not a thing that was built. It is a reaction that is still happening. One we simply started and cooled and shaped and then walked away from, leaving it to finish across a span of time longer than any of us will live. The most ordinary material on Earth, poured in a large enough quantity, stops behaving like a building material at all, and starts behaving like a slow, living, heat-breathing thing that has to be tamed. The builders of the Hoover Dam didn't just pour concrete. They started a fire that gives off no flame, that would burn for 125 years, and they built 600 miles of ice water veins to keep it from tearing their dam apart. And then they let the reaction they couldn't stop keep going, quietly, in the dark, right up to this very day.